So the title of my dissertation is Towards Holistic Environmental and Climate Change Education, Understanding Climate Emotions in a Pre-Service Teacher course on climate change. Before we get going, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. So this is the land acknowledgement that Penn State has, and it was written in collaboration with the Indigenous People Student Association, as well as the Indigenous Faculty and Staff Alliance. And so the Pennsylvania State University campuses are located on the original homelands of the Erie, Haudenosaunee, Seneca, Cuyahoga, Onondaga, Oneida, Mohawk, and Tuscarora, the Lenape, including the Delaware Nation, Delaware Tribes, Stockbridge, Munsee, Monongahela, Shawnee, Absentee, Eastern and Oklahoma, Susquehannock, and Wazazi Osage nations. As a land-grant institution, we acknowledge and honor the traditional caretakers of these lands and strive to understand and model their responsible stewardship. We also acknowledge the longer history of these lands and our place in that history. Okay. So for the introduction, why climate emotions? I don't know why my computer's not working. I'm sorry. All right, so climate change is a global issue with far-reaching impacts, especially in minorities and marginalized groups. Emotions are becoming more prominent in mainstream media and academic literature. Many environmental education researchers identify addressing emotions in educational spaces as needed, and more research is needed around climate emotions in pre-service teachers. As youth in the US, so ages 16 to 25, are substantially concerned about climate change. And so the aims of this dissertation are to explore the literature with a systematic literature review, and then to conduct a case study on the intersection of climate change education and emotions in a pre-service teacher course. And so I did this research with an undergraduate pre-service teacher. She's now pre-med. Her name's Aubrey. She couldn't be here today. She had an interview for a volunteer at a hospital position for the summer. But she did this research with me. She was a student in the course. And then at the end of the course, I asked if students wanted to be involved in the research. And she wanted to be involved, and I paid her for her time as well. And you can see a little bit of information about both of us as well. So for my theoretical and conceptual frameworks, I use sociocultural learning theory, so very traditional Levin-Wagner, communities of practice, where the learner has an independent relationship with the world, as well as situated situated participation. Sorry, I'm nervous. Transformative education is a conceptual framework within the sociocultural learning theory that I use, and it focuses on heads, hearts, and hands. So the academic, the emotion, and the action. And then I approach emotions as social or relational, and I draw on Ahmed, Bowler, Collins, and Siegel. Siegel is a medical doctor, but he does acknowledge that emotions, we have emotions to help us interact with the world, and we're interconnected, and emotions are in the body. You can't separate those, as well as our interactions with other people kind of dictate our emotions and are mediated. So essentially, emotions are not solely in a person, but are in relation to another subject and object. So for the literature review, I conducted a systematic literature review prior to diving into the case study. These are the research questions. I was looking at overall broad characteristics as well as the main themes. And some of the conclusions that I found were that environmental ed needs to move towards more holistic practices, meaning like including emotions in education. Transformative education was one of the methods that seemed to have the most promise in this literature review, and that youth deserve a space and place in the curriculum design, which is also why I had Aubrey involved with the research as well. And then I conducted a smaller lit review on just pre-service teachers and climate emotions. And it showed that if teachers had negative emotional experiences, they were less likely to feel confident in teaching and approaching the subject with their students. And so I felt like that was like a needed area of research. So for the research questions, Aubrey and I developed these research questions together. And so she had a couple of interests that she wanted to look at, and I had my own interests, and then we came together and kind of formulated questions. So question 1 has to deal with in what ways did pre-service teachers experience climate emotions over the course of the term? And then the research question 2 was how those emotional experiences impacted or influenced their perspectives on climate change or education specifically. And then research question 3 are in what ways did the educational strategies that I implemented in the course help the pre-service teachers in processing their emotions surrounding climate change. So for the methods, I use case study. Case study is appropriate because case study is very bound by time and place, and this was done in a course. So it had a specific start and end point. It had a set number of students in it. I used a humanizing research frame from San Pedro and Clinock, and that frame allowed me to center the relationship between me and Aubrey in the research and analysis process. So we were true co-researchers in this. And then the context again is it was fall of 23. It was a climate science for educators course. And with pre-service teachers, they were mainly first and second years. So 18, 19 years old, first starting into college, and yeah. So for data collection, I had a number of different types of data. So I did semi-structured interviews, and I did them in focus groups to more align with the sociocultural learning theory. And so only 5 students consented to the interviews. So I grouped them in 2 and then 1 of 3. And I was a part of that interview as well. And it was very much back and forth. Like I was sharing about myself too. And then I used student artifacts, which was like some of their assignments from the course. So journal entries and in-class work. And the journal entries, it was 300 to 400 words, and they did them every week. And so for 24 students, there was, I think, like 15 journal entries. And then field memos and observations. I took field memos after I taught every class, and I did my best to remember what I could. It was my first time teaching the course, but those were used to triangulate the rest of the data. And then also I had my teacher artifacts, so my lesson plans and class materials. Oh, wrong keyboard. All right. So for the data analysis, we use inductive analysis, and we operationalized emotion using class definitions. And so at the beginning of class, we all came up with, I asked the students, like, without any like lecture information ahead of time, what does emotion mean to you? What does feelings mean to you? What does emotional process mean to you? And then I also used some literature to support those definitions as well. Use both a priori and in vivo codes. A priori to align with theoretical and conceptual frameworks, as well as things like the activities we did in class. And then in vivo codes just coming up through the analysis process. For the a priori codes for emotions, I initially used the climate emotions wheel from the Climate Mental Health Network. And then if there was any emotion that the student mentioned that was not on the wheel, then they got added to the code book. We tried to attempt for iterated reliability. We did 2 rounds trying to get it, and it did not work. And we think it's to the nuanced nature of emotions and interpreting them. So after that, we ended up doing consensus coding 100% of the way on all data sources. That was last summer. That took a while. And then we did 2 main rounds of coding. So the first one was simultaneously coding. So just finding emotion or the pedagogy used. And then the second round was a pattern coding, looking at those relationships in between, like the emotion and the pedagogy, or emotion and the value. and looking at patterns in those relationships that the students were talking about. And the patterns were identified from the entire coded data set. And this is an example of a nature journaling activity, and you can see some of the codes that we placed on it. We did it all by hand. All right. All right, now I get to the fun part. So the findings. Amy, can you come up? Yeah. Okay. So this is a table with the findings in relation to the research questions. And so for research question 1, which is just overall what the students experienced over the course of the term. So starting with this top theme, emotional growth over time. So I don't know if people can see over Zoom. All right, so in the beginning of the course, this was a SASE survey, so the Six Short Americas survey from Yale. A lot of the students coming into the course, like this was before any course material, was alarmed, concerned, and cautious. And so they had a lot of like negative emotions. So like I'll just put like alarm here or concern. And then towards the, again, wrong keyboard. The week 7 of the course, this was their word cloud. So you all just did a word cloud coming into the course. And there's some overlap. So I see that you all, a lot of people are frustrated, have anxiety, despair, sadness, anger, anxious, but there is hope in there as well. And as you can see with the students, they had more of these, what we call negative emotions. And then, there are some hopeful emotions as well. So they are concerned, but there's a little bit of hope there too, towards the beginning of the term. And then, so I'll get to the end of the term in just in a second, but during the course of the term, there was a couple of themes and patterns that popped out, and those were relevance, increases emotional interest. And so if I used examples like we talked about, like in that fall, flooding in New York was big, and some students were from New York. And so if we talked about that in class and they knew family members that had were impacted by the flooding, they were more interested in that, as well as if they had heritage. So I had one student who has Peruvian heritage. I found a video and I found content around what is happening in Peru, and it led him to be more engaged in the course itself. And so we have that, like, also here kind of in the middle, we have interest as well as interest. And then so for power in relation to action and identity, so this was a textbook that we used in the course. This is a compilation of essays, poems, and writings by women all over the world, especially women of color, women on the front lines of the climate crisis. And my students felt really empowered by the fact that they were reading writings and a text written by someone who they identified similarly. So like, as you know, a lot of my students were young women, and the texts are written by women. And so they felt a lot of empowerment there. There's also mentioning of a little bit of helplessness and powerlessness due to like lack of action on like a government scale and things like that, or even like if they came from a family that didn't believe in climate change, things like that. But you also have empowerment here in the middle. And then, so for hope in the face of the climate crisis, by the end of the term, they were feeling more hope, and they were feeling hope in relation to three main sub themes relating to hope. So one is action, so either on an individual level or a collective level. So 87% of students felt hope related to action. Increase in general awareness of climate change, like I know more about it. I know now other people know more about it. That was a reason for hope, as well as the course itself kind of goes an overview of climate change information at their level, but then also helps facilitate ways that they'll be able to teach it later. And so knowing that they feel confident in being able to teach it, or they can teach it later, they had hope in that as well. And then so for question 2, so what this emotional experience and how it influenced their perspectives on climate change and education in general. And so, wrong keyboard. This figure is a little small right now. I'll zoom it in. But the top is learning and developing awareness in the course, flowing into experiencing emotions based on what was learned in the course, then processing those emotions, and then developing new perspectives on climate change and education. And so on the climate change side of things, they have so we have climate change and we have education. For climate change, the recognition of climate change impacts on them personally was a big pattern that we noticed. A lot of them came into the class being like, oh, well, climate change is a thing, but it doesn't impact me personally, to, oh my gosh, this actually impacts me and my family, as well as acknowledging emotions as the first step to taking action. So knowing that that is the first step to moving forward through those emotions to be able to teach this in the future. And then for education, they came to value the community-oriented learning environment, as well as a relationship with the more than human world, or with the outside the classroom world. And then also a value of and confidence in teaching climate change to their future students. And for for research question 3, so looking at educational strategies implemented in climate change for educators course, we're looking at pedagogy involving a relationship with the more than human world, and a pedagogy involving classroom community building. And those do kind of tie into the research question 2. So what they came to value also were the pedagogies that helped them the most in the class. This is an example of an activity that I did with them, where we led a mindfulness walk outside, and I had them put away their phones and just kind of like pay attention to the things around them, and then had them do a body mapping exercise where they could feel in their body where they what they were feeling in their emotions. And so this is an example of a pedagogy involving the more than human world, where they get outside, they interact with the world, and then do some embodied and somatic learning. Another example is nature journaling, which they all loved. And it involves going out to a natural place, sitting down and observing a plant or an animal or a landscape. And these are a couple different examples. It's kind of open-ended. And so we have let's say body mapping, we have nature journaling, and then they also valued community-oriented learning environments. And so here is an example of a student quote that highlights how important the community was in the class for their processing of their emotions. And so the highlighted part says, as this class went on and we talked about our emotions and why we have them, I feel better when climate change is mentioned. My body doesn't go into fight or flight mode, and my anxiety has been reduced. I understand now that others feel the same way as I do, and I'm not alone. And I thought that was pretty powerful statement. And so then we have like community-oriented learning environments. All right. All right, and before we go to a discussion, I want to, can we flip this? it makes a tree, which I felt was a pretty good metaphor for the growth and learning and connection that happen in the course as well. As you can see, the roots are the educational pedagogies, the foundation. Their journey is the trunk, with branches being how their journey is affecting different perspectives that they hold. And then you have like they're growing to be a bigger tree. So thank you, Amy. Yeah, we're good. Okay. All right. So for we're like, okay, we have these findings, like, what do they mean? And so I wanted to discuss just a few points. So one is emotions and climate change learning. Emotions is critically important in learning, especially climate change learning. And emotions should be a target for learning, and not just, you know, like they should be embedded in a target for learning as well. Power related to the creation of knowledge. And so I really tried my best with the students and with Aubrey to reduce that power differential, and to have our knowledges really be collaborative and participatory, and really come together. So yeah. And climate anxiety and whiteness. And so there's some, as climate anxiety and climate emotions become a more researched field and area, a lot of academics are paying attention to different dynamics within the space. And so, you know, there is some people who are noticing that you know, marginalized, minoritized people are the first and worst impacted by climate change, but white people are more now expressing climate emotions and anxiety, and we need to not silence or take space. We need to also create space for multiple lived realities. So yeah, and then communities of practice. And so this emotions are mediated and normed in a community of practice. And so I think it's really important to think about the community of practice that we are in as educators. And this is an example of, this is the learning environment of 112. The instructor, that's me, the individual pre-service teacher and their peers, and that's a community of practice, but then they also go into their future classroom and we'll have a future community of practice, and that's integrated together. And so norming, emotions are normed in a culture, and so you it's to kind of take that into consideration when you're teaching, because then going forward they're gonna be carrying that forward or not, depending on how things go in the learning environment. So there's a couple limitations to the study. So limited understandings to be gained from observations. I was the instructor. I wasn't like fully removed. And so my field memos weren't as detailed as they could have been if I was just solely observing. But me also being the instructor allows me to have a greater relationship with them. So it's kind of like you pick one or the other, you know. And then limited understanding of students' racial and cultural identities. So if students self-disclosed, I took note of that. I made sure not to lose that information, but I didn't specifically survey their racial and cultural and socioeconomic demographics. I did have a relatively homogeneous participant population. So a lot of pre-service teachers here are white and female, as the education field in general. And so that was a limitation in understanding climate emotions, as emotions are different depending on what culture you're in and things like that. And there's only a small subset consenting to interviews. So out of 24 students that consented, only 5 wanted to interview with me. So for my conclusions, emotional experiences play a critical role in learning about climate change. acknowledging and processing these emotions is essential to developing confidence in teaching about climate change in our future teachers. And the 3 pedagogical elements of the course that were supported were community-oriented learning, nature-based activities, or fostering a relationship with the more than human world, validating emotions by fostering open discussions around climate change. And the recommendations are for climate change education to include these 3 pedagogical elements to support learners. These are my acknowledgement slides. I'm probably over on time, so I'm just gonna pop that up there. And then that is the end. Thank you. And let me know if you have any questions.